Every leader has a strategy. Executing on that strategy is the challenge. If you want to learn how to effectively achieve what you've set out to accomplish, then this show is for you. Gain keen insights and listen in as leaders share their stories and challenges. SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation welcome you to Leader Dialogue Radio.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Duffie Dixon, and you're listening to Leader Dialogue, brought to you by SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. Joining me is the CEO of SOAR Vision Group, Ben Sawyer. He has more than 30 years of executive leadership experience. He launched the SOAR Vision Group with the idea of aligning people with purpose and to help them achieve exceptional results. And also joining us is Lisa Council. She is the Chief Commercial Officer. I was going to go CCO. Chief Commercial Officer. She comes to SOAR with more than 2 decades of clinical leadership and clinical informatics experience. And joining us again this week is our special guest. He is Craig Clapper. He is the founding partner of Healthcare Performance Improvement, or HPI, and he is a partner in Press Ganey Transformational Advisory Services. And I want to first say thank you for joining us, but also we did not give you any props for your new book, so we're going to do it right off the top. We've got it right here.
Excellent. Yeah, Zero Harm came out November 2018 by McGraw-Hill. Wrote it with my partner, Dr. Jim Merlino from the Cleveland Clinic, and then Carol Stockmeyer, another HPI founder.
And it's Zero Harm, How to Achieve Patient and Workforce Safety in Healthcare. And this gets us right into our topic. Now, we get you 2 weeks in a row. So, Ben, catch listeners up to what we talked about last week.
Yeah, so we talked about a variety of different areas of performance. We talked about patient safety. We talked about experience. We talked about efficiency and quality, and how all of those are actually interrelated. You don't get one by just focusing on that one. You actually address all of them. And we talked about what is required to have good performance. We ended with a very interesting conversation, which was, given all the complexity and the need to be able to have specific strategic priorities, how do you make sure that you keep organizational focus? And listeners may recall, if they go back and listen to last week's show, we used the term Hoshin, which in Japanese means shine the compass. In other words, always make sure you know where the North Star purpose is and how you're aligned to it, which is a big part of organizations being able to stay focused and concentrated. And then everything they're doing in strategy should be aligned to that. So tee us off with that, Craig. What are some of the things that you have observed and experienced in terms of organizations that either don't have focus or have that focus, and what's kind of required to be able to get there?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. Is that, recall that last week we really got on the strategy deployment was one of our weaker skills as leaders.
Yeah.
So we should be more systematic in strategy deployment. And then once we have that strategy deployed, we need a leadership system so that not all the leadership work is custom. And I think Duffie touched on it best when she talked about getting the people engaged in that. If you get them playing their roles, that takes a lot of pressure off leaders to coordinate work and improvement. I really lit up with the compass analogy because my partner Carol Stockmeyer talks about the compass a lot. And she points out that the magnetic needle has to be periodically remagnetized. So leaders need to get out there, and when you do that remagnetizing in the metaphor, it's re-energizing your people towards those goals.
Right.
But in the literal sense is you just rub the needle on a lodestone. And you always rub it in the same direction. And I think that's an important thing, especially when you and Lisa talk about alignment. It's always about alignment. You always have to rub it in the same direction. And as a nuclear engineer, I could tell you why. Duffie, she tries to look like she wants to hear the why, but I'm not so sure she's sure.
I'm ready.
Is that the iron atom has a single unpaired electron. All the little electrons are little magnets in themselves, so we usually don't notice it because we cancel each other out. So in a bad organization, you don't see a very alignment. We're canceling each other out. Mm-hmm. But if you can get all of those unpaired electrons spinning the same way by rubbing that magnet the same way, is that you can get that effect. And I think that's the leader lesson from the compass, is you need to get all your people headed the same way.
Right. So for listeners, when we're talking about strategy deployment, there's kind of a normal generic cascade, right? So it starts with this notion of your North Star, statement of purpose, your HOSHN, and then most healthcare organizations will have pillars of various kinds, 3 to 5, that typically represent the areas of focus of the organization. Under those pillars will be strategic priorities. In other words, in that pillar, what is the strategic priority that needs to be able to be accomplished? And it should be associated with a measurable, an objective, what is often referred to as a key performance indicator, something that is clear, repeatable, that sort of thing. From there, it gets into execution, which is, okay, so what are the initiatives that we're going to do to actually make that happen? And initiatives are going to have to be taken on by people, which means there's assigned action items, and there should be then leading measures of, so how do we know that we're actually accomplishing these actions? And it all needs to be connected so that when someone on the front line is doing a particular action, it connects back to the initiative, connects back to the objective and KPI, connects back to the strategic priority, and ultimately the pillar, and should, in all cases, align to the compass, which is what I did is moving us in the right direction.
Yes, because when we do all that, we want to be successful.
Right.
There's nothing worse than executing on your strategy and realizing, well, we're not successful because we didn't have the right strategy. I think right now is we're too small in measurement. It kind of reminds me of like being in a relationship is hard work. So I need to work on it. My plan for next year is I'm going to pick up my socks. And I think that's
That'll
an important
fix everything.
part.
For sure.
Yeah, you don't leave your socks laying around, but you just can't have that one thing and measure it.
Right.
You have to measure enough things that you can be successful. So I like, Ben, your broader, having a safety pillar, a quality pillar, an experience pillar, an engagement pillar, an efficiency pillar. You probably need
Finance pillar, maybe.
in efficiency.
Yeah.
I think Prescani people, when we try to say finances, we say efficiency.
Yeah.
And then have enough of the real time and the lagging and the leading measures, so you have a system of measurement. And then I think where we should go next is talking about daily improvement. How do you get people thinking that way, working that way, and making changes for the better?
Yeah, so let's tee up a concept that we use a lot in our work. It's called catchball. And essentially what happens with catchball, much like it sounds, and Craig's demonstrating it here in the radio.
We
Too
forgot
bad we're
the
not
ball
on
as a
video.
prop.
Yeah.
We
Beach
dropped
ball.
the ball.
So the idea is it starts with leadership. They have the ball, and they've clarified the strategic priorities. They've identified what the objective and KPI is. Now they're passing it off to middle management, essentially, to make that happen, right? Which is really where the initiatives start. So now middle management has the ball, and they, in turn, are going to pass it off to the front line because that's where the action happens. But it's not one way. So the front line is then going to say, got it, but here's what's happening. So we need help. They throw it back up to middle management, throws it back up to executive leadership. And that cadence actually needs to happen on a very, very consistent basis. Typically what we recommend is that the leadership or executive cadence is on a monthly basis at minimum. So they're looking at the alignment of their strategy in a measurable way. We'll get back to that on a monthly basis. That the front line is doing daily work, and that in the middle, with middle managers helping to manage it, is a weekly rounding that includes senior executives so that they can constantly see and learn and understand what's going on. And this ties back to something we talked about in last week's show, which is leaders have authority, but responsibility is shared. So the idea of catchball is it creates a mechanism for that responsibility to be shared in a meaningful way. And if you build in your performance improvement with it as a part of that daily and weekly huddle, it can be a very, very powerful mechanism for organizations.
Yeah, add a couple of thoughts about how the process is kind of iterative, especially at the beginning where the ball gets passed and sometimes it's handed back with what we could actually achieve in that time.
Yes, so the nice thing about catchball is it's reality-based. So you can set up your structure like we talked about, the cascading, but very quickly you're going to find out what works, what doesn't, Should we be reprioritizing? How do we make sure that what we try to accomplish from a KPI is actually being driven by the right actions and the right initiatives? And there's a constant sort of filtering process that says, what are the things that are essential? It's almost like the Pareto exercise. What are the 20% that are actually going to drive the 80, and constantly being aware of that?
Yeah. And it really ties back to last week's radio show. We really talked to getting to the business of execution, right? When we're engaging all the leaders, middle managers, front line, we really start executing on that strategy that oftentimes sits in a boardroom and needs to get dusted off. Now we're putting it into action and utilizing it on a daily basis in most cases.
Yeah, I agree. I think our problem in healthcare is in the catch-ball process. People are handing the balls, but nobody's handing them back.
Right. That's correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, you alluded to this last week, Craig, that we get caught in meetings as if that's our, way of doing things. And what evolves is what I call meeting stew, which means you're not really focusing on anything in particular, certainly not strategy. It's more updates. We had a policy change, whatever the case may be, and that does not line up well with good execution on your strategy. So the idea of a good and robust catch-ball process, once it's set up, is it's like a laser that cuts through the meeting stew and ensures that as a repeatable mechanism every day, every week, every month, all parts of the organization are involved in something that keeps them aligned and focused on their strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you didn't say every second. I would have said, I told you a million times, not to exaggerate.
Yeah.
And how reassuring is that for people on the front line that what we're saying to middle managers at some point will make it up the chain? Because as a front worker, a lot of times you get the ball and you say, that's great, but in reality, here's what's happening. What should we do about this? And there is no talk about it going higher up.
Yeah, so this is where the Toyota production system actually comes in.
Okay.
It's a great example that Craig and I could talk about. So in the Toyota production system, the line worker has the right to stop the line. So if they're doing something that is, not working on any of those performance measures, they are obligated to stop the line, at which point leadership resources and so forth come in to make sure that's corrected, because the production of the whole plant is stopped until that's addressed. We don't empower people typically in healthcare to do that.
Exactly.
Stop the line, or you've mentioned this many times, outside of healthcare.
Yeah.
But actually, I applaud what Prescani is doing and has done over the years, along with HPI. You really are, with zero harm and high reliability, I believe really are putting that powerful mechanism in the hands of bedside nurses and clinicians to really stop the line. Tell us a little bit about how you engage organizations and how you teach them that it's okay for a nurse, again, in a zero harm environment, to really call the shots.
Yeah, that's a really good topic, because everybody in healthcare wants to do well for a patient. Nobody wants to harm a patient or see that happen.
Right.
So it's always been part of the clinician's professional viewpoint that they could and should do that. I think what's happened is the psychological safety has not always been there for them. Psychological safety is an idea from the 70s. I think popular now through the work of primarily Amy Edmondson up at Harvard. You could read about it in her book Teaming, which is brilliant.
It is.
And she says it has to be safe for people to bring up a question. We have to feel safe for people to say no. I have to be able to suggest that we do something differently and better without somebody saying I'm not on board.
Exactly.
Right.
And we can manufacture that kind of psychological safety if we invest in it as leaders. So have a statement of purpose and conviction, but every day leaders do things that are consistent and reinforce that belief. So I would have a leader skill that says protect the people who speak up. And I would have an expectation for my people to, let's say as a relationship skill, provide opportunities for other people to ask questions or be very good in cross-monitoring. And as you have these skill systems, they tend to work together, and it gives you a broad improvement that tends to last.
So that reminds me of an interesting experience early in my career. I was working with a large health system where they did a merger and 3 different cultures came together at the same time. And I was responsible for one area of operations where these 3 groups were coming together. And there was fighting right out of the gate and mistrust and challenging performance. And I was coming in as the new manager.
The newbie.
That had to be fun.
So I had an executive
Rose-colored
coach.
glasses?
Yeah. I had an executive coach at the time, and I was describing what this was, and she said, "Here's my recommendation, Ben. Meet with every person and ask them, do you feel safe? Just ask them that." And I was like, really? Like, with all the stuff that needs to happen, that's what I should ask? She says, "Trust me." I said, okay. So once I got in and got introduced and so forth, I started to ask for individual meetings with people, and that was part of my lead-off was, do you feel safe here? And if not, why not? It was cathartic. It was amazing. I mean, people started to share from their perspective what wasn't working. Mm-hmm. Some people were in tears. It was a watershed, and it gave me great insight as to what is required actually to be able to create a high performance organization. So it surfaced issues that we can then talk about as a group and address. And ultimately, that particular group became very high performing. It didn't take a long time. It was
about trust.
It was about
That's
trust
huge.
and
That
communication
is
and
huge.
That's exactly
transparency
right.
and exactly what you're talking about, Craig.
A good leadership lesson is it's not magic, but when it works, it's magical.
Yes.
I think that's the magic of the Toyota production system. It's, yes, they could stop the line, but they rarely have to because they already feel safe to improve the work.
Yes.
So that was done the week before and the year before. So in those few events, they do, in fact, pull the
Lever.
Yeah, that's a little Japanese name, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's a test.
Come on,
It's a
first one to
test,
win. I
and-
got a buck on the
And
table.
we're moving on.
We're moving.
How about those bulldogs?
Go dogs.
Well, it's
You
a
got-
part of It's part of Poke-Yoke. And it's an andon system.
Andon.
So it's an
Good
andon.
job,
Ding, ding,
Ben.
ding, ding,
I
ding.
knew I'd recognize the right answer
Yeah.
when offered.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben,
He
for
just
bailing me
well
out
from
on
Well,
multiple
that.
by the
choice.
way, so for listeners, andons are actually fairly easy to understand, like in cars. If you have one of those lane change things where that's an andon. It just says, hey, you might want to take a look at this because I think you're leaking over into the other lane. That's essentially what an andon is. And then the Poke-Yoke is a response to that to make sure that
Error proofing.
it's air proofing. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I think there's also Baka yoke.
Yeah.
There's a
is
test at the end of this
More
for
like
all of our
idiot
listeners.
proofing, right?
I'm just happy I don't have to
I need
spell
some
it.
of
That's
the
the
Baka
extreme
yoke.
thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Extreme. Extreme leadership
Yeah.
radio
Yeah.
error proofing.
So let's go back out in our conversation because we talked about last week the complexity of healthcare, right? It's a complex system where you're trying to get standardization not on one dimension, but on, I think you mentioned 5 dimensions or so at the same time. And therefore, it's complicated. How can we maybe in this conversation start to clarify how you can take some of the complexity out of high-performing systems?
Yeah, because we agreed last week that we needed a little more simplicity.
Yes.
That complexity usually follows system error rate. Our thinking is that leaders need structure.
Yeah.
So give them leadership systems. The people need structure. So you need the right mix of standard work plus some thinking together in teams. Oftentimes, we guide our clients and say, define the patient experience as safety, quality, and then how patients and family experience that. It's perceptual quality. And then do that on a high reliability platform. Now, I think the mistake that we've made is healthcare leaders think that high reliability organizing, or HRO, is an all-in-one framework. And it's not. It's like a little bit of magic inside the machine.
Right.
Is that they'll still need something with a little broader framework. And an easy way to point that out is there's nothing in high reliability organizing, HRO, that does strategy deployment.
Right.
And if you talk about principles, a lot of people say, well, we all know there's 5 things. Well, they're probably talking about the Wyke and Sutcliffe 5. Rene M. Alberti had 5. I trained under Chong Chu. He had 5. there's probably 30 thought leaders in high reliability organizing. Each one had 5, 7, or 9 principles. None of them had 6 or 8. 5, 7, or 9. And they're all talking about how to do that one thing. So our job is to take those descriptive theories of high reliability organizing and translate that into daily activity. And the best way to do that is to package it as a set of skills and then have your leaders practice those skills every day. Package them as universal skills for every provider, caregiver, and staff member, and have everybody practice those every day. But to do that, Ben, we really need to shorten the field because there's really too many that are evidence-based. Like how many evidence-based thinking skills? 20. You could probably teach 1.
Right.
How many communication skills? Like 18. You probably want to teach 5. We just need to rein it in so we could operationalize those ideas.
Correct. And another thing we have experienced is there are organizational structural models that can be more effective in the deployment of this. I'll give an example. A hub and spoke structure like we see in airports is a great example of how you can organize your operation to make it more efficient. Because if I'm in a hub, I, by vantage point, have a bigger view, and my role needs to be a certain way. Whereas if I'm a spoke of the hub, like a gate agent or a pilot, my role is a little bit narrower but more detailed. And what it allows is the reduction of complexity of everyone having to own everything. And healthcare has been slow to adopt that, but it's actually critical in orchestration of activity, and we can provide some examples of that.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. It's that we need to invest in leadership systems to manage the work system.
Right.
And then we need a work system that has a healthy balance of process versus policy and protocol, the paperwork.
Yep.
If paperwork made systems safe, healthcare would be safe by now.
Right,
Yeah.
Sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then people, I think we underprescribe people who can think and think together as a team, and we're overprescribing the paperwork. High reliability is the right mix. And that might be important for our listeners to know is high reliability is a statement of excellence. You're just saying that we do these important things very well. High reliability organizing, or HRO, is a narrow discipline that talks about how people-based systems can move from good to that great notch. So in the Wyke-Sutcliffe model, they'd say, well, we have deference to expertise. Toyota would say we have respect for people. In Wyke-Sutcliffe, they say we have a preoccupation with failure. I think the Toyota leaders might say, go see for yourself. Go see for yourself. Right. Is that there's a lot of theories that grew up separately along the same universal ideas. But my point, and I do have one here, is that those 5 Wyke-Sutcliffe things, not one of them said that you had a process that works. Not one of them say the knowledge and skill of your people are good. Not one of them said your leaders have aligned the organization around the right moving forward goals so we could be successful. That all has to be there before you can plop that HRO right down in the middle.
Right, that's a big input. So talk a little bit about that transformation. So again, as you move large organizations into a high reliability state, there is an inordinate amount of transformation that has to occur and kind of pre-existing systems in place.
Yeah, I'd recommend, and this is our practice at Press Ganey, is that first, everybody's done a lot of work, so you always have to honor previous work. Find out what's making them successful, hang on to that jealously. Have a nice framework, like we're talking here about the Baldrige Framework, and I like your simplified version of that. It helps because simplicity follows reliability, or vice versa. And then look at strengths and weaknesses. Usually they have something and it's partially deployed with gaps. But I think the big difference in our practice at Press Ganey is that we do a common cause analysis of loss events. We look at maybe patient experience loss events. We look at harm events. And that gives us insight into how the system is failing so that you can adjust your going forward strategies to address those previous failures. My boss, Chong Chu, he's an MIT guy. He theorized that a complex system should be able to reduce their loss events by 80% every 2 years.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's a big number because of the complexity of the system. You know, in the Swiss cheese effect, if there's 8 things that go wrong to harm a patient, that also means we had 8 chances to prevent it. If we prevent one of those 8 things next time, we prevent the entire harm. So I'm not really saying that we could remove 80% of the defects, but it's 80% of the events. And most people can get that kind of result, but maybe not in 2 years, probably more like 4 years. In fact, our good friends up in Boston at Children's Hospital, they reported that they're at 80.8% reduction in serious preventable harm at 4 years.
Wow.
That's good.
That's awesome.
Our good friends at Inspira in southern New Jersey, they're at 79% also at 4 years. So I think there's a lot of good work out there, but more work needs to be done. And sustainment has been a huge challenge for us, which is where, Ben, I think your solution comes into play.
Yeah, so maybe for the listeners to create a practical example, in healthcare, moving patients through the organization is a big part of what they do, right? The coming in either through the emergency department or through admissions, getting onto a nursing unit, seeing all the different multiple diagnostics and provider care, ultimately getting to a timely and effective discharge with an anticipation of what is supposed to happen after they leave the hospital. All of that is quite complicated and handoff. So going back first to the operational structure and then next into what you're talking about, Craig, the idea is if in your hub you're able to identify patients coming in, both in terms of volume, do they meet medical necessity criteria or appropriateness for admission? Is this the best place for them, or is there something better for them, a different level of care? Once they are on the unit, is there then, based upon their presenting condition, a working, what's called a diagnosis-related grouping to say this is what their length of stay should be, and does discharge begin upon admission? Is there a coordination with diagnostics between what they're scheduling outpatients and being able to actually schedule inpatients in there so there's not unnecessary delays, right? Yeah. Are interdepartmental transfers effective? Is there a good point of care rounding so that the care team that is managing that patient, whether it's the hospitalist or attending, the charge nurse, the case manager, et cetera, are all on one page, including with the patient and their family, so everyone is working towards a target discharge? That's a practical example, right, within healthcare that requires a tremendous amount of coordination. So just starting off that example, the structure of a hub and spoke works quite well because you can manage from the hub all of the sort of logistical components, bed availability, staffing, whether there is a clarity of length of stay for each patient, that kind of thing. And then at a spoke level, that's where the rubber meets the road. Like, do we actually have a plan, and are we on the plan, and how's it working in terms of the patient itinerary and that kind of thing?
Yeah, those sounded rhetorical as questions, but the answers would be no, maybe, yes, no,
great,
maybe.
Thank you. That's good memory.
Because I think it highlights the problems that we have in healthcare thinking about reliability. We want it to be very linear and process-oriented and have zero defects. And that kind of standardization makes systems very brittle. And recall last week I said healthcare is more complex and is very nonlinear. So it puts our nurses in a position of saying, hey, I need you to step up, Ben. I have you for 3.2 days length of stay, and you're not going to be well enough to go home. I need to get a little more out of you. And we laugh because we hope that's not true, but we kind of worry that it might be like that. So we have to realize that not every patient fits on a protocol.
Right.
Not every protocol works for a patient. Some of those patients take their own clinical pathways. So we have to have a system that is reliable, in that process way, and then it's also flexible or resilient. If you like a tree metaphor, we want it to be strong like the oak, but also flexible like the palm. And we can get that kind of oak-type reliability out of the electronic healthcare record, which drives our process and coordinates a lot of work. But we have to get that flexibility, like the palm tree, out of people who think together as a team. And they're not going to think together as a team unless they have that psychological safety.
Yep.
And they're not going to have that unless their Ben sits in the office and says, do you feel safe?
Right.
And I trust you.
Yes.
You know what you're doing with those patients. You let me know what you need. You know the patient better than I do. I'm in the hub. You're in the spoke.
Right. And going back to the metaphor we used last week, which was the orchestra, this representation of the orchestra being less rigid is, I think you pointed out, more of a jazz band. So maybe you can explain as we wrap up this segment what you meant by that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Ben, because the orchestra that's well practiced on the same piece is kind of strong like the oak tree. They're going to do great, but if something happens, they'll probably fall apart. They'll just try to get back on track. But if you think of the great jazz ensembles, they have great knowledge and skills. They have basic strategy and architecture, but they pay attention to each other, and they're able to improvise. And I think that might be the answer for us in these performance cultures of the future. When I look like a factory, can I act like a factory? And when healthcare doesn't look like a factory, can I perform well together and think like a team?
So if you are not a jazz aficionado, you may want to go listen to some jazz, because that is a good metaphor of what a high-performance organization in healthcare can be. Craig, thank you very much for your participation in these 2 weeks.
Good. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it. Great things to think about. And again, a reminder about your book, Zero Harm. We'd love for people to read that and give us feedback. Also, we want to thank everyone who listens each and every week, and especially for listening this week. You can always have a new live show in your ear every Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. You can visit businessradiox.com and find our show, and also leaderdialogue.com/podcast. On behalf of Ben and Lisa and our producer, Mike, we want to thank you for listening to Leader Dialogue. I'm Duffie Dixon on Business Radio X.